Que bueno, mi gente. Calix Boxing here, Throwback Edition. Jermain Taylor versus Winky Wright. This is a fight I want to talk about because it's a fight that I recently went back and watched parts of. And someone once told me, you don't remember people from what they tell you. You don't remember what they say, but you do remember how they made you feel. And that's why I've been going back and watching a lot of fights, because these older fights give me a nostalgic feeling, just a good time in boxing, good time watching these fights, and current boxing just doesn't do it for me. I haven't been really paying attention to what's been going on the past 2 years, to be honest, and not really. I can't really remember any fights in the past 2 years that give me that nostalgic feeling. That's why I've been going back and watching a lot of these throwback fights. And it's hard to believe a fight that happened 10 years ago, that happened in 2006 is considered a throwback fight. It's hard to. It's you realize that 2006 is a decade ago, and it's like, man, you're getting old. But Jermain Taylor versus Winky Wright happened June 19, 2006. It was for the WBC and WBO titles that Canelo and Billy Joe Saunders now hold. But what intrigued me about this fight is it's just a weird fight in that it was the first post Bernard Hopkins middleweight championship fight, first post Bernard Hopkins middleweight fight that mattered, the first fight that didn't involve Bernard Hopkins that really mattered, that had high stakes in the division in quite a while. And Bernard Hopkins had a stranglehold in that division for so long. And Jermain Taylor, this kid from Arkansas, 25-0, came out of nowhere. I think he was 23-0 at the time he fought Bernard Hopkins the first time. Came out of nowhere and beat Hopkins not once but twice, arguably, but he did it twice. So you thought to yourself, okay, if this guy beat Bernard Hopkins, a guy who is tough to crack, either Bernard Hopkins is getting up there in age, or this guy Jermain Taylor is a special fighter, or maybe both. So Jermain Taylor goes on the next fight 6 months later to fight Winky Wright. Winky Wright's a guy who had some really good wins, especially the two against Shane Mosley 2 years prior. And all of a sudden, I think this was his second or third fight at 160. So it wasn't really a developed true middleweight, never was, and was coming up in weight. And what's weird about the fight is, if you go back and watch it, is it was an exciting fight. And Winky Wright was not in exciting fights. And this was really a setup fight for Jermain Taylor, if you think about it. Jermain Taylor was a guy who could beat. They saw him beat Bernard Hopkins twice, so they figured, okay, another defensive fighter, we can beat him on activity just like we did Bernard Hopkins. If you can beat Bernard Hopkins on activity alone, you can do the same thing to Winky Wright. What they weren't expecting was Winky Wright, who was getting up there in age, was going to be more offensive minded. Defensive fighters, when they get up there in age, they have to be more offensive. And Winky Wright came out of nowhere that fight and just started fighting an offensive-minded fight. And it was a firefight, and it was a very good fight. And I had the fight a draw, and it was a draw. Winky Wright disputed the draw. He felt that he won the fight. I thought it was a justified draw, but it was a very good fight. And it was in Arkansas. And it had the type of environment that you'd see from a Terrence Crawford fight in Nebraska these days, to where the locals really came out, supported him. It was a football type atmosphere, and it was just a fun fight, from the crowd to both fighters showing up, and you really saw the flaws of Jermain Taylor. Like, the guy is very talented, very athletic, but you saw the flaws come out, and that's when you start to say, oh, okay, maybe this guy isn't the middleweight hero that people think he's going to be. And this was really the beginning of the disarray of the middleweight division. Bernard Hopkins had that stranglehold for forever, much like Vladimir Klitschko had the stranglehold of the heavyweight division forever, and now the division's in disarray, and a decade later it still is. This still hasn't been solved. Okay, Jermain Taylor, a couple fights later, loses his belts to Kelly Pavlik. Taylor never had the big middleweight run that you'd like to see guys have who unify the titles. And Sergio Martinez never really satisfied what you would want the middleweight title holder to look like or to be, or to, he never had that stranglehold in the division that Bernard Hopkins did for such a long time. His reign at middleweight lasted, a couple years, and he wasn't that, I don't know, that feared guy at middleweight that you'd like to see. And a decade later, you have Canelo now has a WBC belt. Billy Joe Saunders has a WBO belt. And Gennady Golovkin has these other belts, and Gennady Golovkin isn't able to unify these belts because nobody wants to fight him. So you still have this disarray 10 years later. And just the narrative around that time was interesting as well, because Bernard Hopkins was seen as washed up. And I think a couple months later, or a year later, he beats Antonio Tarver at 175, says he's going to retire, and then a decade later, the guy's still fighting, and he has some good wins in that decade. And then Jermain Taylor, who beats Bernard Hopkins, you thought the trajectory was going up for him, and the trajectory was going down for Hopkins. It ended up being the opposite. And Jermain Taylor never had a big, after those Hopkins wins, never had a big middleweight win. He was really fighting bloated 154-pounders for a while in Kasim Uma, Corey Spinks, until he got to Kelly Pavlik. And you got to remember, the Kelly Pavlik fight wasn't even supposed to happen. They were setting up an Edison Miranda fight. Kelly Pavlik goes in there, blows Edison Miranda out, and Jermain Taylor and Edison Miranda were trying to build that fight up. Kelly Pavlik was supposed to be a tune-up for Jermain Taylor. Edison Miranda gets blown out by Kelly Pavlik, knocked out, and then Kelly Pavlik ends up knocking out Jermain Taylor in that next fight. So, just interesting times. But that Jermain Taylor versus Winky Wright fight, June 19, 2006, go on YouTube and watch that fight, man, because very good fight. And it's hard to believe that it was a decade ago, and hard to believe that a decade later, the middleweight division is still really in shambles. It's all over the place. There really hasn't been a great middleweight champion since Bernard Hopkins lost those belts in 2005, 2006.